Excellent. Okay. Well, I think that we'll begin, and I just want to say hello to everybody and to welcome you to TidePool Bookshop's first TidePool Together event. So we're really excited, and I am Joe Truesdell, and my husband Huck is. I know he's here somewhere, but he's there manning the virtual waiting room. He's on a rectangle somewhere, and. But we're just we're like to have you all here, and while we wish that we were able to welcome you into our actual bookstore at 372 Chandler Street in Worcester, that hopefully that time will come, hopefully before too long. We're really grateful to at least be able to welcome you to this virtual way of doing things nowadays. And I think that one of the things that we found with doing it virtually is that there are people who are able to be with us on a Thursday night that would not be able to be with us otherwise, because they've come. We've got people here from Florida, from Ohio, from New York, from Maine. I think someone said Sam and Sam were here, right? I think, and from Martha's Vineyard, and I think that my sister from Chicago is supposed to be here, and I know she's supposed to be here. Whether she is here or not, I'm not sure. And she's likely here with her puppy Lucy. So that's really great to have that chance to have people from far and wide join us. But we're also certainly really delighted to have all of our local guests as well here for this first of our ventures into the virtual world. So our mission at TidePool Bookshop is actually to connect with organizations in Worcester as often as we can. And so tonight we're really excited to be together with Preservation Worcester to sort of grab onto the coattails of their 50th anniversary, which was celebrated last year, and to highlight Preservation Worcester's celebratory book, Saving the Best to Last, which was published by TidePool Press last December, I think it was. So Jim Welu headed up Preservation Worcester's 50th anniversary committee, and so we're delighted that he's here in one of these rectangles. I think I see him. Hi, Jim. So we're delighted that he's here. And as well, we have Deb Packard, who's been with Director of Preservation Worcester for 16 years. So we're delighted to have her here also. And so together, they're going to be leading us on a walk down 50 years of Preservation Worcester, and nobody needs to walk at all. You can stay right where you are, but it's really, so that's great. But before I turn this over to Deb and Jim, I just want to remind you that that we are recording this talk. Of course, it's all about preserving history, but also we want to be able to put the recordings on both Preservation Worcester's website and also TidePool's website. And also in case of a barking dog or ringing telephones and things like that, I think Huck has probably muted everybody except for Jim and Deb. And actually he hasn't muted me yet, but he's going to be doing that in a minute too. And I'm sure that's, as we were saying earlier, I'm sure that's something he wish he could do that at any time, all day long, but he can't do that. There's no button for that. Thank heaven. But I do want to also say that if you have a question, there's a little chat button at the bottom. I think it's orange, and so if you press that button, a little chat box will come up, and you can type whatever questions you might have, and then at the end, I will, and it's all going to be anonymous actually, and at the end, I'm going to relay the questions to Deb and Jim at the end. So if that makes sense to you, that would be great. And so I really thank you so much for all being here. This is really great. And so I'm going to turn it right over to Jim and Deb and Megan, who is doing all the slides, right? So great.
Okay, so thank you, Joe. We're starting with me. And I'd really like to thank you and Huck for inviting us to participate in this virtual meeting. I just got a notice on my phone that I'm actually supposed to be giving a talk at the Willard Clock Museum at 5:30.
Oh.
That was scheduled, obviously, and postponed, but we do wish you great success in your bookstore. We're excited that you're doing that. I'd also like to thank Megan Blomgren Burgess, our education director, who helped, and also Ingrid Mark, who helped us not only with the book, but working on this presentation. And obviously, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today as well. The Worcester Heritage Preservation Society was founded in 1969 and is now called Preservation Worcester. It was formed because buildings all across the city were coming down because of urban renewal. And Tommy Donnelly Dearborn gathered friends at her home on Rutland Terrace and talked about the idea of forming a society. And from that, we were founded. Our founders include Tommy, John Curtis, John Herron, Buzz Knowlton, who is also our first president, Monty Rockwell, Sherb Rockwell, Tammy Butler, who's with us today, Sylvia Caswell, Claudette Engvall, Origati, Carol Ann and Donald McPherson, and Charles Mercer. And when we were formed, Buzz Knowlton said the first order of business was to identify, isolate, categorize, and list the architectural and historical contents of the city, which was a huge job. I met with Tommy when I first started at Preservation Worcester and asked her about the early years. And she told me that she would go and try and meet with bank presidents and CEOs of organizations, and they just weren't interested in historic preservation. They were interested in new architecture, and they thought the way to develop the city was to tear down the past and put up something new. John Herron told me, I had a wonderful conversation with him, and I quote, for years it was a crisis organization. Right off the bat, the People's Bank wanted to buy the Quaker Meeting House on Crown Hill. That was just going to be the end of Crown Hill if it happened. We yelled and screamed and we were able to stop it. That is when our interest in Crown Hill developed. There were other things. The cast iron building that we tried to save was knocked down. We didn't do well in the beginning. We were always losing. It was, in its beginning, and has remained a grassroots organization running on a shoestring budget and always relying heavily on volunteers. And that really continues to this day. We have a staff of 3 people, and we really couldn't carry on what we do without our volunteer help. Many of our original participants remain active in our organization and support it, and as well as some of their heirs as well. And the Herron family is a great example of that. Over the years, we've had a major impact protecting a lot of our architecture, and you'll hear about that later. And we've also had some really painful losses, including the Foster Block many years ago, and more recently, Notre Dame Day Canadians in downtown Worcester. We have matured over the years. We now have a staff. We started out as all volunteers. We secured a home. We have a headquarters, but we actually have a space in another building and own buildings. And very importantly, we've earned a seat at the table. When you hear Tommy's comments about people not paying attention, people pay attention to us now, which is really important and gratifying. Our early efforts seemed mostly focused on pure historic preservation, saving important buildings for future generations. And although that is our mission as well today. We also have a broader focus. We are promoting neighborhoods. We're building partnerships. We can't do things without building partnerships. We're touting, and I believe it's very true, that historic preservation is an important economic development tool. We're engendering community pride. And most recently, preservationists say that preservation is green, that it's way greener to save a building than to destroy it and build a new one. As Joe mentioned, in 2019, we started celebrating and did celebrate our 50th anniversary. And we were so fortunate that Jim Welu agreed to chair our efforts. We had a wonderful gala, and you can see we are in Higgins' house in this picture. We started with an old PW tradition of having dinner parties in private homes. And then we had a wonderful celebratory event at Higgins' house with a birthday cake and cocktails and music. And it was a wonderful time. Always being a scholar, part of Jim's ideas was that we should also write a book, and I couldn't have agreed more. As we get older, we would be losing our history. So we decided, and Jim spearheaded our process of writing Saving the Best to Last. I'd like to turn the microphone over to Jim now, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about our 50th anniversary and its importance.
Okay, thanks, Deb. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Well, as many of you know, I didn't grow up in Worcester. I came here almost a half a century ago now, and right away I was so impressed with, I would say, not just the collections, and certainly coming to the Worcester Art Museum, the architecture and all, but Worcester has such wonderful collections, from its museums, as you know, to its wonderful libraries, not only the colleges, but great libraries like the American Antiquarian Society, but also its collections of architecture. And at the same time, it's our biggest and it's nationally renowned, internationally renowned collection, and it's the hardest to maintain. And so I was very touched and honored when I was asked to go on the board of Preservation Worcester. And I have to say, a wonderful staff to work with, a small but hardworking staff, as we know, and also so impressed with the volunteers who have gotten involved in Preservation Worcester, not only early on, as you'll see tonight, but also currently, and who carry forth the great tradition of preserving Worcester's architecture. If we have the next slide, you'll see that the kind of things that were happening in Worcester just before I arrived. You turn the next slide, yeah. This is Front Street, just looking down from the Common toward the train station. And I hate to say that about, you can go back, sorry. Go, yeah. About 85 of those buildings went down during urban renewal. Now, Worcester was not alone on this. My hometown out in Iowa, same thing was happening when it was out with the old and in with the new. But Worcester did suffer tremendously in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. And so if we go to the next slide, you'll see, one more slide. Yeah. Okay, yeah. You'll see here a gathering of people. You can go back there, Megan, thanks. People
There's a little bit of a delay.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, these people are gathered on the steps of the Governor Davis home, which I'm sorry to tell you is no longer standing. We'll talk a little bit about later when we tell you more about the history of the demise of architecture in Worcester. But these are people that many of them you know. John Heron's there, Louisa Dresser, and then you see some of the Heron children, John, Jock, and Frank, and Josephine there as a young girl. And I was touched by that these people, in fact, many of them that helped found Preservation Worcester was still with us, but if they weren't, the next generation of their children were. And I thought we write a book now rather than 50 years from now at the 100th anniversary, we can do that too, but we would lose so much history. And so I approached Jock Heron, who founded TidePool Press, and Jock said, why not? Great idea. And I was so pleased he said yes to that. And we raised some money for it. And of course, TidePool Press was very generous itself. And now we have a book. And I'm going to have Deb turn it over to Deb to tell you a little bit about the contents of the book and who contributed to it. Deb?
Yes. So when we were discussing the book, we decided that we didn't really want to write a dry history of the organization, that we really wanted a book that people could read, pick up and maybe read a chapter or look at from time to time. And so we reached out to 4 individuals that had a long history and a long-term perspective on the organization. And we asked them each to write an essay. Jock Heron wrote, and Megan, if you could go to the picture of the herons. Jock Heron, who is co-founder and partner at TidePool Press and also teaches at Harvard Graduate School of Design, begins by writing a chapter, Preservation Worcester 50 Years. He expanded on research that had been done by a Holy Cross intern, Karina Cardenas, and he used his extensive knowledge of our organization. And his chapter is lively and informative history of the organization. Frank Heron, who's pictured on the left when he didn't have a beard, is a former newspaper journalist, a former journalism professor, and a partner in TidePool Press as well. And his chapter is called Scratch a Building, Find a Person. And it's an engaging essay that draws upon his knowledge of Preservation Worcester, his work as a journalist, his family, and his travels, and is really interesting to read. The picture you see here is actually a ribbon cutting of John and Franny Heron Park, which is in Crown Hill. And that's a little pocket park that we own with Jo in the middle of her brothers. Another chapter is called The Beginning. It's written by Susan Ciccacci. Susan's been a member of Preservation Worcester since 1970. She is a well-known architectural historian. She is a former board member and also was a Preservation Worcester education director for a period of time. And she brings us a great perspective on the early years of Preservation Worcester. And then the other essay is written by Alan Fletcher. Alan is a local business person. He's a key player in the development of the Canal District, and he is the recent developer of the Worcester Market in the Canal District. And his essay is called The Presence of the Past. And he talks about the Canal District area, a view of the Canal District from his home and from his perspective, drawing on the past, the present, and the future of the area. And then the book concludes with a series of articles on the different neighborhoods of Worcester. We use a tagline saying that we preserve neighborhoods for people, and our neighborhoods are so unique to our city. So we have a series of articles that were published in the Telegram that they said we could use in our book. I'd just like to give a real thanks to Ingrid Mock, who worked really hard and went on above and beyond in her role coordinating the book. I really enjoyed working with her. And I'd also like to thank Jo Heron and Tammy Butler, who were instrumental in helping us find pictures and even more importantly, identify people and projects. I would like to now turn the mic back to Jim, and he's going to discuss the early years of Preservation Worcester.
Thanks, Deb.
Crown Hill.
Deb, the next two images relate to the part about the Telegram and Gazette also gave us material to deal with the different neighborhoods.
Right.
Yeah, okay, all right. Okay, well, in a way, to look at the beginnings of Preservation Worcester, I can't help but think of the Salisbury Mansion, which is one of our great buildings that date back to our colonial history, and is one of only two preserved homes here in Worcester now. So much was lost during the industrial boom at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, when just so great architecture bit the dust. And if you look at the history books at the beginning of the 20th century, you want to cry to think about how many buildings were destroyed. But happily, the Salisbury Mansion, which is the home of the Worcester's leading family that came out to Worcester during the Revolutionary War, Stephen I, it was saved in the late 20s. And a key person in that was Louisa Dresser, who was the chief curator of the Worcester Art Museum for 40 years. And you see on the top image there where it was down in Lincoln Square. And it was not uncommon to move buildings a lot in the 19th and early 20th century. And they did move it up to its current location. And you can see it from the black and white image. The sign next to it says it's the Craft Center. It was used as the Craft Center for quite a while. And then after about 20 years in its current site, they were thinking about tearing it down or doing something with it, but not preserving it. And so then the Salisbury Mansion Associates was formed, and this included people like Louisa Dresser and John Heron and others, and they saved it. And now we're so fortunate that the Historical Museum takes care of it, and it is a museum in itself, a house museum. As Al Southwick, our great historian, who's about to celebrate 100 soon, has said, it was the first concerted effort to save Worcester's heritage. Now, if we go to the next image, you'll see that this is what Worcester looked like about maybe about 5 or 6 years before I came here, when they were tearing down some 85 buildings to build the Galleria, and also, as you'll see, 290, right behind City Hall. As Susan Ciccacci, who came to Worcester a little before me in the 1960s, said, when I got off the bus in Worcester, it looked like a war zone. Also because of 290, as you can see, it went right through the heart of Worcester and didn't spare a lot of buildings. And one of the buildings that it didn't spare, we'll look next at, and that is Governor Davis's home, which was just up from Lincoln Square on Lincoln Street, a wonderful Greek Revival building. And people were very concerned about it. This is the building in which you saw the Herons and others sitting on. And the person who led the charge to save this building was Tommy Dearborn, as Deb has already referred to her, as you see here. And she got together other people. Unfortunately, it was not saved, along with a couple other Greek Revival buildings. It went down. It's now, as you take the on-ramp up to 290, it's very depressing to just think about that off of 290. In any case, these people were determined to not have that happen again. And so next slide, Tommy pulled together a group of people that became part of the beginnings of Preservation Worcester. And you can see there John Heron and also Buzz Knowlton, who, as Deb said, became the first president. And a lot of the credit to Buzz, because he decided what we needed to really do is inventory back then the important buildings of Worcester, and then make sure we save the most important ones. If we look at the next slide, you'll see the first director of Preservation Worcester. We don't have a lot of images of Janet McCorson, but there she is in an auditorium seated next to John Heron. And she was a dynamo, as many of you know. It did great things for the organization and really got it moving along with those other volunteers. So we have the next slide. You'll see that this was their first great victory. The Quaker Meeting House, a building by Stephen Earle, one of Worcester's greatest architects from the 19th century. And up in Crown Hill, they saved it. And this sort of set the step to go forward. Not only that, but they invited people to come into that neighborhood and take up residence, if possible, to really preserve some of those wonderful buildings, which many of them are preserved now. If we look at the next slide, you can see a wonderful building that stood on Main Street. And this is a sad story, because this was a building built in 1854, and it was thought to be the oldest cast iron front building in America. And they were out to preserve it. And one day they woke up and look what it looked like that morning. Next slide. It was torn down overnight. It's just so sad to see this building. You can imagine how livid people like John Heron, an architect, and Tommy Dearborn and Buzz Knowlton were. And their determination was that's not going to happen again. And so it's hard for us to imagine today that one of the buildings that they had to work hard to preserve was, as you see in the next slide, a building we're so proud of, one of Worcester's greatest buildings, Mechanics Hall. One of the great buildings in America from the Civil War period. But this was almost about torn down, or the wrecking ball about to hit it. And so other people besides the Preservation Worcester were involved, but if we see the next slide, every time we go in this building, we just can't imagine that they were thinking of tearing it down. Then the museum, or the organization had some ups and downs, but some of its successes were, next slide, you'll see, for example, the Union Station at the upper left. You see how it looked like, many of you may remember, trees were growing inside the building. It was about to collapse. And now as we go to get on the commuter rail, we see it there on the right, all well preserved, both inside and out, a great victory for the city. But also other areas of town, neighborhoods, as you see in the next slide, the Quinsigamon Village was, whoops, I guess we don't have that slide, but anyway, was another area that the Preservation Worcester played a major role in preserving not only the church there, the library, and the school. And the moving of that church is the cover of the book that we're now promoting. And now I'm going to turn it over to Deb, who will tell you a little bit about some of the activities in those early years.
Yes, I kind of called this part of the talk preservation tools. And I think one of our major tools is our education program, which was started in 1979. That's when the first docent class was taught. And at that point, it was a 20-week course. It was organized by Becky Moore, and Susan Chikachi was taught the first program and has been, I think, involved in pretty much every education program since then. And you see a picture of Tammy Butler there in the red sweater. She was one of our first docents. She participated in that first class and only recently retired from being a docent. We provide tours, illustrated talks, programs, and do research, and have effectively done that for over 40 years. Our programs now are led by Megan Blomgren Burgess, and each year now we reach over 10,000 people through our programs, which is pretty amazing for a little organization like ours. And we've talked a bit about the importance of serious research. And in 1980, we were the first city or town in the state of Massachusetts to have a listing of multiple properties in Washington. We did a street survey and surveyed over 1,100 properties. This was done under the auspices of an architectural historian. And those surveys we still use today for research and programming. Later on, and you'll see in these pictures, we did another study of three-deckers and got a number of the three-deckers in Worcester on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1984, we published a book called Worcester's Best, a guide to the city's architectural heritage. The book contains photos and information on 650 structures that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This book, which is now in its second edition, is a wonderful guide for people interested in serious research as well as interested in the architecture of the city. We have that book for sale if you're interested in purchasing it, and maybe someday it will be at TidePool bookstore as well. In 1997, after trying for years and years, the city passed what's called a demolition delay ordinance. And what this ordinance does for a historic building is it automatically imposes a year, well, it was at the time it was passed, it was 6 months, but now a year of a cooling off period where organizations and people can work with the owner of the property to find a solution other than demolition. This, the idea of passing the demolition delay ordinance finally caught on after the flag block on Main Street was demolished overnight. It was a mid-19th century building that just came down, and it really caught the city council's attention, and they wanted to make sure something like that did not happen again. This is a picture of the Donnelly Taylor Mansion, which was one of the first properties saved by the demolition delay ordinance. And during my tenure, a lot of buildings have been saved by the demolition delay ordinance, including the Chestnut Street Church, the Kimball House on Lincoln Street, and the Central Building on Main Street. They're all standing because the owners were told that they needed to wait and have conversation. Another important program that started in 1982 was the Historic Marker Program. This program calls attention to historical buildings and the stewards that take care of them. And over although it started in 1982, over the years it waned out, and we revived it again in the 2006. And this is a picture of us giving a marker to the first people in Worcester that got a marker from us. Another really important preservation tool is establishing local historic districts. And Jim's now going to talk to you about our efforts to create the 3 historic districts in the city.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Well, the Herons really set, shall I say, we're great role models for this, because John and Franny Heron moved into Crown Hill area from the west side, sort of took over this wonderful house you see in the slide here, but also to be like a watchdog to make sure these other buildings didn't go down, and monitor it, and they did a good job. The first local historic district, if we go see the next slide, is one that I have the pleasure of living in now. It's just so fabulous. And we owe a lot to Frank and Sid Callahan, who are residents of Mass Ave, this local historic district. And I often think, had they not been around and pushing for preserving these buildings, many of these buildings were owned by different institutions. We'd probably have parking lots on our front lawns, and it just would not have the character that it has today. If we go to the next slide, you'll see these wonderful homes that really represent the boom of Worcester at the turn of the century. It was a planned neighborhood. And of course, we have the book that Susan Ciccacci authored that tells us all about the history of this wonderful area, and the street that includes the second original courthouse of Worcester. You can't get more American history in one building than that. From the American Revolution to, if you go back, sorry, to other great instances like the first documented ruling of getting rid of slavery in America, etc. So this was very important, and this was established in 1975. The next one was established in 1980, and that's the Montvale Local Historic District, and this is across the Salisbury Street. Next slide, which which includes a lot of residences from the late 19th and early 20th century. And I have to say that so many of those buildings are now well preserved. The owners are taking good care of them. And then finally in 2013, Crown Hill became, with its many wonderful examples of Greek Revival buildings, became the third local historic district. And this is a great guarantee that these buildings will remain and will continue to have the character they had at the turn of the century. And now we're going to go to Deb again, who's going to talk about some of the more recent successes.
Thanks, Jim.
Mhm.
So some of the major successes recently was the restoration of the fire alarm and telegraph building in Elm Park. This is a great project, and we were fortunate as a partner in this project to have a function space that we call the Park View Room in the ground level of that building. Another recent success was Stern's Tavern. This was a property that was going to be demolished. We took ownership of the building and in partnership with Seven Hills Foundation, relocated it to the park in next to Coe's Pond. And then another huge success was the central building on Main Street, which the owner definitely wanted to demolish. It's the recent, the ribbon cutting for that was held last fall. It now is a residential facility on the top floors, and then the bottom floor has a daycare center and a market. What I've learned from my tenure at Preservation Worcester is that these projects are really difficult and challenging. They require partnerships. When we try and go it alone, it's way more difficult than when you have a partner with you. It also requires perseverance. We're working right now on Mission Chapel, which was recently bought, and that was on our second endangered list in 1996. We also have to be pragmatic, and we also need to compromise. Our projects sometimes are not purely the way we would envision them, but without compromise, most of them would not have evolved at all. My closing comments are going to be on our efforts to save the clock tower at Worcester State Hospital. This was, and this will just be an example of the process we go through when we try and save a building. You might remember in the early 2000s that a decision was made to close the Westboro State Hospital and Worcester State Hospital and combine them into a new psychiatric facility. It was determined that the old Kirkbride complex would be demolished and that the new facility would be put right on top of where the old complex stood. The area was compromised in many ways because there had been a horrendous fire there that had damaged a lot of the buildings, and there had been partial demolition already to the complex. We assembled a great group of people, not only preservationists, and we had a lot of interested preservationists, but also psychiatrists, people who had worked at the former Worcester State Hospital, people who had been in the Worcester State Hospital, people who had family that had been there, neighbors, and also the general public. And we worked with the Division of Capital Asset Management and the Division of Mental Health, and what was not as contentious as you might expect it to be, but really in a respectful way. We started out, once we knew that there was no, they would not consider trying to repurpose the buildings there. And you had to keep in mind that the ultimate goal is you had to have a facility that that addresses the needs of the people with mental illnesses. We asked that they consider keeping the administration building and Hooper turret standing because they did not stand on the footprint of the building. And we started a letter writing campaign. We had an online I-petition, which was new in that day. We had letters to the editor. We got permission from Beechwood Hotel to put a big banner on their property on the corner of Belmont Street and Route 9. When we met with civic leaders trying to get their support, and Senator and Congressman Jim McGovern was really helpful for us and supportive of our efforts and a key player in all this. Our first success came when the state agreed to spend up to $200,000 on a assessment to see if it were possible to reuse the clock tower, the administrative building actually, and the Hooper turret. And they came back with the finding that yes, it was reasonable if there was enough parking and a couple other things. But the most important part of that was whether the project would qualify for state and historic tax credits. We reached out to the National Park Service, who came back and said no, because it was in a district and there had been so much demolition that it would not qualify as a district. We went back and said, okay, well, can we do it as separate buildings? And they came back and said, no, the administration building had been partially demolished, so it would not apply for tax credits. And we were brokenhearted because without the tax credits, the project would not work. But never daunted, Preservation Worcester board member and a local architect, Rob Parra, came up with this thought: why not save the interior part of the administration building, which had this clock tower that you see, this is his concept, inside. And we proposed that to the state. It's a compelling and interesting sketch and thought. We had a series of meetings scheduled with the state. It was our last meeting. We went there. I was sure they were going to say no. And much to my surprise, they said, yes, we will do that. We will work with you. We'll come up with a design plan and work on as partners on this. And that's what we did. In the final analysis, they thought it was safer and cheaper to actually number the elements of the building, take it down and reconstruct it, which it did. And I am always happy when I'm driving on 290 or coming into Worcester from Shrewsbury, and I see the building on the landscape. It's highly visible from different parts of the city. Dr. Leonard Morse, who many of you know, was one of the people on our committee, and he called it a beacon of hope for people with mental illnesses. I look at it as a tribute to the architecture of the complex and also the important role that Worcester played in the early treatment of mental illnesses. I get comments often from people that are at UMass Hospital saying how wonderful it is to look up and see it up on the hill there. I'd just like to conclude by saying that we look forward to our next 50 years, and we invite you to join us in our efforts. We need all the people we can get to join with us and help us out. Our book, if you're interested, is available on our website. I think there are also a few copies at TidePool bookstore if you're interested. And now I will turn it back to Joe. Thank you.
All right, so there's everybody. Oh my gosh, that was so great. And Deb and Jim, you guys, yeah. Oh, that's great. But you guys covered everything so well that there aren't any questions. I think you anticipated everything that we wanted to know about Preservation Worcester and its history, and that was absolutely wonderful. If we were at the bookstore right now, we would be offering you a glass of wine and some cheese, which we aren't able to do that over Zoom. So unfortunately, you're going to have to go and get your ice gun. You're going to have to go and get your own. But what we can do is thank Jim and Deb for this great our foray for being the first people to get together with us for our TidePool Together event, our very first event, and certainly to thank all of you for joining us. But what I want to do is hug you all, and I can't. It's so hard because one of the things about Zoom is then it just sort of when it's over, it's like over, right? You just say no. But I'm looking at all of you, and I just so appreciate your all being here, and we look forward to having you to welcome you into the bookstore as well when we do open.